Wait a minute, is this it? Oh my God, maybe this is it. 9 people have entered the waiting room. Okay, maybe this is it. See, waiting room, 15 people are in the waiting room. Start video. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Tap up the top.
Oh, I don't need
Good
to.
evening, all.
You'll see the other people that are also down.
Won't you bring the chair in?
I will.
I apologize for the slight delay as I was sorting out how to sign on.
Speaker. Hi, John.
Well, it's
Hey,
impressive
John.
that so many people are ready to spend a Sunday evening talking about the ratification of the Constitution. So welcome, everyone. And I really want to thank the Friends of the Truro Meeting House for organizing this and other programs, even though sadly we're not at the Meeting House. Still, we can engage in the kinds of discussions people have been having in the Truro Meeting House for 2 centuries. And also thanks to the Friends of the Truro Library for helping to organize this. And I really want to commend the Truro Library for having a book pickup service. You can drive up and pick up books at the Truro Library, even though you can't go inside. So we're all figuring out ways to make it through this very interesting time. So thank you all. And so I'm going to talk a bit about probably the most interesting and important political debate in the country's history, and that is the debate over ratifying the Constitution. You know, the debate, the decision for independence had happened in a lot of town meetings and other things, but Congress made the decision in secret. And then in the summer of 1787, the convention to change the Articles of Confederation had happened in secret. Not a word was allowed to breathe out. In fact, they kept the windows closed during a summer in Philadelphia for fear that word would get out about what was happening inside. And then once the Constitution was published in September of 1787, a national debate began. A debate which really engaged people both at the highest levels of American public life as well as ordinary folks like us, meeting in taverns, meeting in churches, meeting in public meeting houses, and just meeting personally to talk about what this new system would mean and whether they supported it or whether they opposed it. You know, James Madison, who probably had as much right as anyone to venture an opinion on this, so that if we're really looking for the meaning of the Constitution, we wouldn't look at the debates in the Philadelphia Convention, which had drafted it. But because he said what the convention offered was, he said, would have been a dead letter. What really gives it life were the voices of the people in the state conventions which ratified it, because there we can find out what they thought this document meant and why they supported it or why they opposed it. So this is really an extraordinary debate by people who were very well informed about politics, what Madison called the science of politics, as well as about the problems of power. And if we understand the founders, we know that power was one of their obsessions. Not that they wanted to seize it, but that they wanted to control it. And they recognized that power is essential in a lot of ways for to protect a society, to help a society prosper, but also it's something that can destroy a society. So it's something that needed to be controlled. And this is really what the Constitution set out to do, or what the framers, and that's a word we probably shouldn't use too much, set out to do. So we have this document presented, a new plan of government presented in September of 1787. And in order for the Constitution to take effect, 9 states had to ratify it, 9 states meeting in conventions. The guys who wrote the Constitution recognized that the Constitution was going to take power away from the state legislatures. Thus, they wanted to bypass the legislatures in ratifying the Constitution. So that's one political reason for doing this. The philosophical reason for doing this is the Constitution rests on the sovereign power of the people. And the people have delegated certain powers to their state governments, in their legislatures, but other powers the people retain for themselves. So this is an act of the sovereign people, and people in our system, as you should be aware, as I hope you're aware, are the sovereigns. So you have this Constitution proposed, and then 9 states would have to ratify it for it to take effect. And almost immediately, there is a big public discussion about this. And it starts off rather badly for the proponents of the Constitution. And by the way, proponents of the Constitution, we often call Federalists, because that's what they called themselves. And their opponents, the main reason their opponents opposed the document they proposed was they didn't think this was a federal constitution. A federal constitution would have retained power in the states. This constitution, they thought, sent too much power to a distant government. So it wasn't a federal constitution, it was a national constitution. And that's one reason a lot of people opposed it. People had other reasons for opposing it. Specific clauses of the Constitution, which we could discuss, really worried folks. But for example, Congress will from time to time publish an account of its proceedings. Well, what does from time to time mean? The Senate and the President could make treaties, which would be the supreme law of the land. That is 2/3 of the Senate. Well, the Senate at this time, if all 13 states joined the Union, would be 26 people. And a quorum of the Senate would be 14 people. That is one more than half. So 2/3 of 13, I'll let you do the arithmetic, means a very small number of people are going to be able to create the supreme law of the land. The Congress would have about 100 members, that is the House of Representatives. At this time, the Massachusetts House of Representatives had about 400 members. So how are you going to have 100 people making law for a country that stretches from Maine to Georgia? And what do Maine and Georgia have in common? And also Congress will determine the time and place of elections to Congress, which means Congress could say, okay, the representatives from Massachusetts will be elected on the 3rd Sunday of March in Worcester. Congress decides where the elections will take place. You're delegating a lot of power to a relatively small group of people. And one thing these folks understood about power is people who held it were likely to abuse it. So that's a series of arguments that people who oppose this Constitution are going to make. And by the way, I support ratifying the Constitution. I'm not sure how it would have stood at the time. I think it was a good thing on balance. But on the other hand, but as I talk about this, I am becoming more and more alarmed about what this system might mean. Now, of course, the big thing that struck people immediately, well, almost immediately as they saw this, was there was no Declaration of Rights. Now, over the past dozen years, the people in the states have been drawing up constitutions. In fact, this is one of the most exciting periods for the development of constitutions in the history of the world. And virtually all of these, most of these began with a Declaration of Rights. As you know, the Declaration of Independence sets out what the purpose of government is. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. It begins with the inalienable rights and then says to secure them, we have governments, which is why the Virginia Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution begin with declarations of rights. That is, this is the reason we're creating a government, to protect these rights. And here you have this Constitution for the entire country, which does not have a Declaration of Rights. And the guys who wrote the Constitution, who come out of this convention with this proposal, and by the way, toward the end of the convention, a couple of members, George Mason of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, had said, why don't we add a Declaration of Rights? And by this time, it was September. Most of the delegates wanted to go home, and they said, no, it's really too late to worry about a Declaration of Rights. you couldn't then tell people who say, hey, how come there's no Declaration of Rights, that, well, we were kind of tired. We'd had a long summer and we thought this was enough. So they come up with a really interesting philosophical reason for why there wasn't a Declaration of Rights, and furthermore, why a Declaration of Rights would have been a bad idea. And this particular idea is launched by James Wilson, a very distinguished lawyer from Pennsylvania. Actually, he was originally from Scotland. And Wilson was a Philadelphia lawyer, and he had one of the real problems for a politician in that he knew he was a lot smarter than the people he was talking to. So he explained to them why a Declaration of Rights would have been a bad idea, because this is a government of limited powers. Any power not delegated to this government was reserved to the people or to the states. So if we had started listing what are the rights this government cannot infringe, and we left something off, that would be disastrous, because then that would imply the government did have power over it. For example, people were upset that there was no protection in the Constitution over the freedom of the press. And Wilson said, well, where do you see any power in this Constitution over the press? It's really a very interesting argument he makes. And it had the effect of making people think not only that Wilson was wrong, that is, people had experience with governments that were going to override their powers, but then he was making it sound like freedom of the press wasn't that important to him. So Wilson becomes really the most hated figure in America for people who opposed the Constitution. I have to say people who supported it weren't all that happy with him either, because he had launched what he thought was the killer argument and had the effect of backfiring. So poor Wilson is being burned in effigy all around Pennsylvania and in other parts of the country. And the supporters of the Constitution are trying to figure out a way to get this thing passed without a Bill of Rights. James Madison also worried about a Bill of Rights, saying that these are parchment barriers, because he knew Virginia had a Declaration of Rights. And one of the rights it protected was your freedom of conscience, your liberty to worship. But in Virginia, the Baptists got taxed to support the Anglican Church. So how is that protecting freedom of conscience if a legislature is going to simply override that particular right that is guaranteed? So Madison thought that bills of rights were not very effective. Wilson was saying you don't really need one. And actually, Noah Webster goes even further. And Webster begins his argument by saying first that half of the people who read don't understand what they read, so probably they shouldn't be allowed to read anyway. It's probably a bad idea to start off by telling your audience that they're really too stupid to understand what you're saying. But then he goes on to say a Declaration of Rights would bind every legislature subsequently, because you can't change it. So if we added it now, we would essentially be making future generations our slaves by having a Bill of Rights. Madison sent a copy of the Constitution to Thomas Jefferson, who was the American minister in France. And Jefferson saw these things he really didn't like in it, these features I mentioned, but plus no Declaration of Rights. And he also read James Wilson's speech. And he said Wilson's speech might do for the audience for which it was intended, that is really smart Philadelphia lawyers like James Wilson, but it won't do for Americans. And he said, a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. And Jefferson also said, Madison said, bills of rights aren't that effective because a legislative body will overturn them or will find ways around them. And Jefferson said, yes, but if they do, then people who are affected by this will be able to go to court. So Jefferson in 1787 is arguing that the judiciary is going to play a role in protecting a Declaration of Rights. And he said a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. So you have this argument starting about this Constitution, and the proponents of it are adamant that we don't need to add any bills of rights or other things. We can amend it later on. And the opponents are trying to stop it. Now, as I said, in order for this to take effect, 9 states have to ratify it. And Pennsylvania, which is where, of course, the convention had met, wants to have a convention early. A convention has to be called by the legislature The opponents of the Constitution were saying, we want to slow this down. So we don't want the convention to meet too early. Now we know we don't have a majority in the legislature. So in order to prevent the legislature from calling a convention, we'll stay home. We won't go to the legislature, and thus they won't have a quorum. They won't be able to vote and call a convention. Well, the supporters of the Constitution say, you know what? We want these guys to be in the legislative chamber so we can vote. We know they are going to lose. We know we have the votes, but we need them to have a quorum. So they send out the militia to round up these members of the legislature who were staying home as a way of preventing a quorum, and thus they're brought into the legislative hall by the members of the militia, that is under armed guard, so that legislature can vote to call a convention. Now remember, these opponents of the Constitution are saying what these guys are trying to do is to create a government that can strong arm us, that can govern by military force. And here almost immediately, the Federalists in Pennsylvania are proving them right. So this is an extraordinary time. And then the convention in Philadelphia met in December, and there are about 23 opponents of the Constitution who had been elected to the convention. There are 46 supporters, and every vote is 46 to 23 in this convention. Now, there are 23 articulate guys elected to this meeting, but they're going to be outvoted. So there's no real reason to listen to them or to argue with them, although James Wilson does argue with the minority. They point when Wilson says again, this is a government of limited powers. Any power not given is reserved, and thus you don't need a Declaration of Rights. John Smiley, a member of the convention, says, well, okay, how come Article 1, Section 9 says Congress doesn't have power to pass an ex post facto law or a bill of attainder or suspend habeas corpus? Here, these are particular rights. That is habeas corpus, a particular right, which you say Congress cannot overturn. Does that mean Congress could overturn every other right? You know, the opponents of this see the fallacy in the arguments the Federalists are making. A government of limited powers, well, if it's so limited, how come there is a power somewhere to suspend habeas corpus? Good question. The vote in Pennsylvania, by the way, was 46 to 23, and almost immediately there's rioting in Pennsylvania over the outcome of the convention. The opponents feel that they've been rushed into this, that they're being strong-armed, and they have some justification in saying this. Now, meanwhile, a couple of the smaller states have ratified unanimously. One of the interesting things here, I should not say that things are interesting. I should let you decide whether they're interesting or not. The smaller states during the convention had really balked at being overrun by the bigger states, but almost immediately when the Constitution was published, the smaller states see this actually is pretty good. And so Delaware was the first state to ratify. If any of you is from Delaware, you probably are aware of that Delaware was the first state to ratify, and it ratified unanimously. And New Jersey also ratified unanimously. But then you have Pennsylvania, the first of the big states to have its convention, and it results in rioting, civil disorders, and so on. Okay, the next big state to meet was Massachusetts. And remember, Massachusetts earlier in the year 1787 had a rebellion on the frontier over taxes. People in the western part of the state thought that the legislature had raised taxes too high and was doing other malevolent things. Maybe in a future year we can talk about what was happening in western Pennsylvania in 1787. And now you have this convention meeting in Boston, and about 18 members of the convention had been participants in Shays' Rebellion earlier in the year. That is, they were naturally opposed to a stronger government which could raise taxes, which this new proposed one definitely could. Another thing here is Elbridge Gerry, you'll recall, had been a delegate to the convention from Massachusetts and had refused to sign it for a variety of reasons. The last day of the convention, Gerry said he wasn't going to sign it, didn't like the fact there was no Bill of Rights. Also, he said, there's a civil war brewing in Massachusetts between the supporters of democracy, which Gerry called the worst of all political evils, and their opponents, who are just as violent and bad. I suppose Gary is what you would call a moderate. And during divisive times, moderates always get it from both sides. So Gary says he wasn't going to support it. However, he becomes really the chief, the expert witness for the Massachusetts legislature and then for the convention on what the Constitution meant. Also, Samuel Adams really didn't like this Constitution. He wrote to Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, another of the old revolutionaries, "I confess, as I enter the building, I stumble on the threshold." The threshold being the words, "We the people of the United States." Well, Adams wondered, who are the people of the United States? And how can they form this Constitution? Adams had spent most of his life fighting against a distant, unrepresentative government. And he knew the only way to protect liberty, or I should say he believed the only way to protect liberty, was to have a government over which people had control, as they did, he thought, in Massachusetts. You have this government of the people of the United States with 100 members of a House of Representatives. That is one for every 40,000 people. And then you have a Senate of 26 members and a president. They're going to forget where they came from, as politicians sometimes do. And so Adams was really worried about this. So he probably one of the most powerful political figures in Boston and in Massachusetts. And he doesn't like this Constitution. And there are about 400 members of this convention that meets in Boston. It met at the Long Lane Meeting House. The pastor was Jeremy Belknap, and it was the biggest building in Boston, which is why it could accommodate this big gathering. And John Hancock was elected to preside. Hancock had recently been elected governor, a very popular figure, but also very cautious of his popularity. And Hancock knew if he took a side on one side or the other, it was going to cost him friends, which is something Hancock never wanted to lose friends. And so what happens, he's elected to the convention elects him to preside, and he knows however this thing turns out is going to be really bad for me. So his gout flared up, which it often did when John Hancock had a particularly difficult challenge ahead of him. So he could not attend the convention, but he remained at his mansion on Beacon Hill, waiting to see how things turned out. And the convention does go over every line of the Constitution, scrutinizes it. But these people really are jealous of their liberty and wary of surrendering any liberty to a distant government. And if the convention had voted at any point, they probably would have shot it down. The supporters of the Constitution know if Massachusetts rejects it, that's probably going to be the end of the game. The next states to consider this would be, well, the next big state would be Virginia. And in Virginia, things looked very bad for ratification. George Mason, one of the delegates from Virginia, had left Philadelphia, James Madison said, in a very ill humor indeed. Mason had said at the end of the convention he would sooner cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution. For a couple of reasons. He didn't like the fact there was no Declaration of Rights. And also, Mason was outraged that at the end of the convention, a bargain had been struck between the New England states who wanted to have Congress with the ability to, without the ability to regulate. Well, let me see if I can make this less complicated. A proposal had been raised to end the slave trade by the year 1800. And Mason, who was one of the largest slave owners at the convention, gave a speech to the convention about the horrors of the slave trade, which he saw as a crime against humanity. And he thought that we should end it with the Constitution. South Carolina and Georgia said, our states will never ratify the Constitution unless we can continue importing slaves. Meanwhile, there was another proposal that the Virginians had made that said, we want a 2/3 vote to allow for tariff laws. They were afraid that the states that benefited from trade would have simple majorities passing tariff laws to protect their trade, and that would hurt then Virginia from exporting tobacco. And what happened was a committee of the convention decided, hey, why don't we make a bargain on this? South Carolina and Georgia will go along with New England and allow a simple majority to pass tariff laws. And we'll go along with South Carolina and Georgia and allow the slave trade to continue for 20 years. Mason was horrified that they would bargain in this way over the issue of slavery. And he said he would sooner cut off his right hand than use it to sign the Constitution. And also on his way out of town, his carriage overturned and broke his arm. So that didn't help his mood. But he goes back to Virginia to oppose ratifying the Constitution. And also the most powerful political figure in Virginia, powerful politically, was Patrick Henry. Henry controlled the legislature. And Henry really didn't like this Constitution because it was going to take power away from people like Patrick Henry. Another real opponent of the Constitution was the governor of New York, George Clinton. In fact, there were 3 delegates from New York. One of them was Alexander Hamilton. The other 2 also opposed opposed the Constitution. So you have New York is almost certain to reject it, Virginia almost certain to reject it. If Massachusetts rejects it, there's no chance this thing is going to be ratified. Remember, you need 9 states in order to bring this in. So the Federalists in Boston, in Massachusetts, recognize a real problem here, that if Massachusetts rejects it, the game is over. So they do a couple of things that are really smart. Once, during the course of the convention, a rumor had circulated that the supporters of ratification, who tended to be more often than they were farmers from Western Massachusetts, they were merchants from the cities like Salem and Boston. And here their country cousins come to town. A lot of delegates from Maine came, and they had never been to Boston. And a lot of people from outside the city are a little wary of it. Well, these great public-spirited individuals determined to show their country cousins a good time and convince them that the city wasn't such a bad place. It got to the point that some of these guys said, well, wait a minute, are these guys trying to bribe us by entertaining us? And the convention actually launched an investigation into this, whether members were being bribed to support ratification. And it turns out they weren't. The convention showed no evidence that anyone was being bribed, simply hospitality was being shown to them. Another thing they did was hold up the mail. The opponents in Pennsylvania, the 23 members of the convention who had opposed ratification, had published their reasons for opposing ratification, published it and sent it to be printed throughout the country, but somehow that the dissent of the Pennsylvania minority stayed in the post office in Boston and never got out. And probably another thing they did was, trade really was suffering because the government under the Confederation could not protect trade. This is one of the real impetuses for having a stronger federal government. Well, the Boston tradesmen saw that actually this stronger government could help us, could benefit us. So the supporters of the Constitution had a rally of the Boston tradesmen at the Green Dragon Tavern, where the tradesmen gathered, the dock workers, the shipbuilders, anyone whose trade had been hurt, to speak up in support of ratification. And they invited Samuel Adams to this. Adams, of course, was a Democrat with a small d, which means he heeded what his constituents said. He saw himself as their representative. And he said, well, maybe they do see things in this to like, which I haven't seen. But then really the masterstroke was calling on Governor Hancock. Before they went to call on Governor Hancock, they said, okay, we want to prevent this thing from failing. So what we'll do is we will offer amendments and we'll say we should ratify the Constitution, and then here are amendments we can live with. They knew that if there was another convention, Patrick Henry certainly would go to the next convention, and other people who didn't like this new system wouldn't stay home but would attend the convention. Whatever system was devised would be much different. So they draw up a list of amendments they think will satisfy those calling for a Bill of Rights. And then they, with this list of amendments, they call on Governor Hancock. And they find him wrapped in gauze in his mansion on Beacon Hill. And they say, this is really a bad situation we're in. We see this Constitution as something that's really going to help us out of all of these problems. But if it fails in Massachusetts, it's probably not going to go anywhere. Also, they say, if it doesn't fail in Massachusetts and Virginia doesn't ratify it, which it looks like Virginia won't. Now, let's just suppose, hypothetically, Governor Hancock, that 9 states, including Massachusetts, ratify this Constitution. But Virginia is one of the states that does not. You're going to need to have a president. And if Virginia is not a state, George Washington cannot be president of the United States. We'll need a president, someone who is known and loved throughout the country, someone who is respected from one end of the continent to the other. And if not Washington, Governor Hancock, who do you think that person could be? And Hancock was intrigued. By the way, the only evidence we have for this discussion comes not from Hancock, who I suppose might have been disappointed with the way things turned out, but from someone who was at the meeting and wrote a tell-all later on. Hancock agrees, and on the closing day of the convention, Hancock is carried in a sedan chair, wrapped in gauze, and he presents these amendments as though he had written them. And also a wonderful speech he gives about this moment that we are in and how this will be something to seal our independence. And he also reminds them that once the Constitution takes effect, Massachusetts will use her considerable prestige as the first among states. And in 1788, it still was possible for a politician from Massachusetts to talk about the Commonwealth being the first among states and not have people in the rest of the country react with righteous indignation, or with ridicule. And the convention does then vote. And the vote in Massachusetts was 187 in favor of ratifying the Constitution, 168 opposed. So it's a 19-vote margin in Massachusetts, likely because of the hospitality, but also this idea that amendments will be added later, that Massachusetts pledges herself to doing this. And this proves to be something of a breakthrough in the discussions. I should say, when Massachusetts Convention first met, the New Hampshire Convention also met, and everyone thought New Hampshire, small state, was going to ratify quite easily. The convention gathered in Portsmouth, and the supporters looked around the room and realized they didn't recognize a lot of these guys who had shown up for this convention. And so if New Hampshire had rejected it, they knew that would pretty much be the end, since it was a safe state for them. So they say, we'll adjourn until June, which was a wise move on their part. So New Hampshire's adjourned until June. Maryland's convention met in May. They proposed amendments. South Carolina also proposed amendments. And the 3 final states to meet, 4 I should say. Rhode Island actually had a popular vote. It's one of the only state to do this. And Rhode Island voted on, by the way, Rhode Island had not even sent anyone to the convention in Philadelphia. Rhode Island was doing pretty well, and they didn't want a government that was going to tax their trade. So they were happy. They also, Massachusetts and Rhode Island were always at odds over this because it was a lot cheaper to import something through Newport or Providence and then get it into Massachusetts rather than bringing something into Boston, where you did have to pay taxes to the state government. So Rhode Island didn't send anyone, and their popular vote in April of 1788 was something like 3,000 some odd votes against 283 in favor. So Rhode Island rejected it. North Carolina also is going to reject it. So by May, you have 8 states have ratified it, and Virginia, New York, New Hampshire, and North Carolina are going to meet in the spring. I keep worrying that I've forgotten a state here or that my numbers are off. So Virginia's convention was one of high drama and intrigue, Patrick Henry is really the dominant figure in, and he absolutely opposes ratifying the Constitution. And James Madison is the spokesman for the supporters of it. And Madison, sometimes, according to John Marshall and according to the stenographer, who has kept very good notes of this meeting, said that sometimes Madison spoke so softly no one could hear him. But later on, and Henry was one of the great orators of the 18th century. In fact, during one particularly dramatic moment, Henry, pointing to this document on the table, he kept talking about that document and what it would do. It would extinguish liberty. And he really brought on the fright of this extinguished liberty. And this is really a hot, humid summer day in Richmond. And as Henry spoke about the extinguishing of liberty, a thunderclap struck, shook the building. And, you know, you really have to be a great orator to pull off a moment like that. And then there is Madison arguing in his concise, logical way about the Constitution actually dividing powers between states and federal government, and about the enlargement of the sphere of the republic to prevent a majority faction from forming to hurt the liberty of individuals. By the way, Thomas Jefferson had suggested that maybe 9 states should ratify in order to bring the thing into effect, and then the others can hold off until there is a Bill of Rights. Madison didn't like that idea, but this becomes an issue in the Virginia Convention. What if 9 states ratify and we become the 10th? That would be a bad thing. Actually, in the Houghton Library, there's an exchange of letters between Madison, who is in Virginia at his convention, and Alexander Hamilton, who was in New York at his convention. And the New York Convention, there are about 46 opponents of ratification, 17 supporters. So New York is likely to reject it. And Madison says, well, things look really bad here in Virginia. And Hamilton writes back saying, well, if Virginia rejects it, New York is certain to. And they both know that's pretty much going to be the end of the story. However, during that exchange, New Hampshire had reconvened. New Hampshire voted to ratify. So there's a 9th state. And then the debate in Virginia really is this debate between Henry and Madison over the future as well as the past. And finally, Virginia voted 79 to 69 in favor of ratifying the Constitution. And then shortly after this, when New York heard that Virginia had ratified, New York decided, okay, we'll ratify too, just so we can keep an eye on things. So you have these 11 states have ratified by the end of the summer of 1788. North Carolina's convention met and rejected it. Rhode Island, as I said, already had rejected it. But you had this big, intense debate over the nature of the Union and the nature of creating any kind of a political society where liberty would be protected. And it became clear to the opponents of it that this government would not protect liberty. The idea that Madison had floated in Federalist 10, that by having all of these different factions fighting it out, you would prevent majority tyranny, didn't really convince people, nor did James Wilson's argument that anything not given is reserved. So one of the really striking things to me about this intense debate pitting people against each other is that once the Constitution took effect, the supporters of it recognized that they had been wrong. And they agreed there should be a Declaration of Rights. And also the opponents of it join in to make sure the system works. So you have this very intense political debate, which seems to be tearing the country apart. And at the end of it, the country does come together under this new system. Those who had created it wanting to make it work, and those who had opposed it also wanting to make it work, but not allow it to crush their liberty with the concentrated power of this government. So with that, if anyone has any questions or rebuttals, you can, at the bottom of your screen, I think, either raise your hand, or if you're on screen, you can wave your hand and hopefully I will see you. Any questions, comments? Or have I satisfied your curiosity on this?
Bob,
Yes, Pat.
one question. How were the delegates to the conventions chosen if they weren't part of the legislature?
Oh, they were chosen by election. There would be popular elections for delegates. And in fact, in Virginia, James Madison had run against John Leland, who was a Baptist minister. And one of the reasons, and other candidates, and Leland was worried that this Constitution, because there was no explicit protection for religious liberty, would be a bad thing. And there's also a candidate opposed to ratifying from Madison's district. And again, I'm sorry, getting in. You asked a very simple question. I'm giving you then a play-by-play. It's this is election night, and I'm giving you the results from the Orange County district. But Madison convinced Leland that actually the Constitution wouldn't hurt religious liberty. But Leland then wants to have an explicit protection of religious liberty, which the First Amendment will have. So popular election, that's the short answer.
Thank you.
Yes, Joe.
I have a question on how did the states choose the number of delegates to these conventions?
It was really up to the state. So in Massachusetts, they were chosen by legislative districts, which means there are about 400. And usually they were chosen by town. They weren't really legislative districts, but towns would choose. And the Massachusetts Constitution, it set out how many representatives each town would have. And so that it is by population. In Virginia, it's somewhat different. You're chosen there by county. And so even though Virginia is a bigger state, fewer members, of course, about 40% of the people in Virginia don't vote because they're enslaved. So you have that similarly in South Carolina, but it is up to each state to determine how many members they'll have in a convention. A convention does represent the sovereign power of the people of the state. So it's different from a legislature. This is why in 1778, when the Massachusetts legislature had drafted a constitution, and then sent it out to the people in the town meetings to ratify, the people rejected it because they said the legislature doesn't have the power to write a constitution. A constitution comes from the sovereign power, which is not in the legislature. So it's up to each state. I'll try to give the short answer, and maybe we'll have an extended version for those who want longer answers to these things. I can't imagine anyone would. Other questions? You can, yes, Chuck or John?
Has to do with the anti-federalist arguments. And again, looking at Massachusetts in particular, was there not serious concern about a representative form of government as it was proposed in the Constitution? After all, in Massachusetts and New England, people were used to participating in town meeting and having a direct voice in government. And that gets tied in with a Puritan point of view about responsibility. Was there a feeling that this was letting citizens off the hook and maybe creating, perhaps inadvertently, a citizenry that did not take its responsibilities seriously?
That's a very
having a representative form of government.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think, you raised a lot of really interesting pieces to it. And so, yes, and the idea of the engaged citizens. I mean, you can also see this not only with the representatives, but with the whole idea of the militia. And because Congress has the power to arm and discipline the militia, but militia duty is something everyone performed between the ages of 16 and 60. All the men performed between the ages of 16 and 60. But then if Congress is taking over the militia, that takes away that very important duty that citizens have. And it really is, you raised a really phenomenally good question about this, about will this create citizens who aren't really engaged or part of this? And the issue of slavery brings this up too. You have people who are part of this, but who aren't able to participate. So it's a terrific question, and you're absolutely, yes, I would say the short answer to that would be yes, there is that great concern. Someone just raised a question by the way, John, we could have a whole series on that very question, and I hope the Meeting House will do that, because that does tie in with the Meeting House's mission. But someone did raise a good question about, was there a mechanism, the states that didn't ratify, what happens, or is there a mechanism to force them? And yes, North Carolina and Rhode Island have essentially a trade boycott imposed on them by the other states. And so you have that kind of pressure then put on them. And Rhode Island did ratify once the Bill of Rights had been proposed and the other states were ratifying it. And the Bill of Rights was in many ways the cost of creating the system. Madison recognized this. By the way, Massachusetts ratified the Bill of Rights in 1939. 12 articles had been submitted to the states, and the state house had agreed to some, the state senate had agreed to others. They couldn't agree on which ones would be ratified. So Massachusetts wound up not ratifying the Bill of Rights. And if you go to the state archives, there's a wonderful museum that has the Bill of Rights on display, and you can still see the creases in it, because in 1789, they had rejected it. So it was folded up and put into a file with unpassed legislation. And there it sat until 1939. A couple of other states also had not ratified in 1789, decided to do so. Someone asks, what's my understanding of the founders' intent of the Second Amendment? That's a good question. It's a twofold intent. One is to protect the militia as opposed to the idea of a standing army. There's a fear that a government like this one that could impose taxes could also use those taxes to raise a standing army. In fact, excise taxes and standing armies went together in people's minds after the 1690s. And the other is to protect citizens' rights to the right to bear arms. One is not contingent on the other. James Madison, who really did write the Bill of Rights, looked at all of the state declarations of rights. And by the way, one of the arguments against having a federal Bill of Rights was the states have them. James Wilson would say that's enough. And Alexander Hamilton said the state bills of rights are so different. How do you decide which ones to include? And Madison did that. He took all of the state bills of rights, as well as all of the proposals the states had made for amendments, and weeded this down to make it concise. And there were two things that kept coming up. You know, Pennsylvania, in their Declaration of Rights, has that you have the right to hunt on public land or on open land. And so this is a fundamental understanding. And because Congress has the power to arm and discipline the militia, the fear was Congress would say, okay, the militia can only be armed with clubs. Meanwhile, we'll have a standing army that will hold real power. So, short answer, the Second Amendment is intended to prevent a standing army. That's why it has a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. That's like a statement, an affirmation of something. But then to make that happen, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It doesn't say you can keep and bear arms if you happen to be a member of the militia. Well, of course, every man between 16 and 60, every free man between 16 and 60 would be a member of the militia. Anyway, good question. If there are, yes, Dan Holt. Can you unmute yourself, Dan? Whoops.
Sorry.
Good.
There we go. So just to follow up on that, was there any argument pointing to the Second Amendment at the point at which a standing army was brought into being, that it in fact violated the Second Amendment?
I didn't hear all of what you just said.
If the idea of the Second Amendment was largely to prevent a standing army, at the point at which a standing army was in fact in the offing, did people oppose it on the basis of the Second Amendment?
Well, the Second Amendment hadn't been adopted yet. You know, and the Constitution, as you probably know, says you cannot have a military appropriation for longer than 2 years. And that was to prevent the creation of a standing army. It makes things a little complicated now because it may take 10 years to develop a weapons system. And So yeah, the Constitution has that prohibition against military appropriations for longer than 2 years.
2 years. Yeah.
And Hamilton addresses this a bit, saying how long it would take for members of Congress and the Senate and the executive to conspire to create a standing army. He saw elections as the critical thing. And then the other point to this is, and getting away from the Second Amendment, was there was a real fear of the fact that members of Congress were elected for 2-year terms. Most states had a 1-year term for members of legislatures. And there was, in fact, if people had bumper stickers then, you probably would have seen a lot of bumper stickers, particularly in New England, with one of the great well-known phrases, where annual elections end, tyranny begins. In Rhode Island, by the way, the members of the legislature were elected every 6 months. That is, you wanted to keep an eye on these people and not have them get comfortable in office. And one thing that would happen if they did get comfortable in office was they would, do things that people who get comfortable in power might do. And I don't want to give you any wild speculations about things that could happen if people comfortable in power, but in some parallel universe. Let's see, I'm looking at some of the questions that people are asking on the chat. Okay. How was New York State flipped? I think you mean from being opponents to being supporters. Well, they recognized the way things were going. And in fact, George Clinton, the governor of New York, was a candidate for president knew he was actually running for vice president in 1789 in the first federal election. This idea that, he still wanted to, and he becomes vice president in the Jefferson administration. That they recognized that they were going to be part of this. And Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts had said he would support if he opposed the Constitution, if it were ratified, he would support it. So you see that. Let's see, what are the arguments for strict construction versus more liberal interpretations? That's a very good question. The idea of a written constitution, inherent in it is that you have something that we all understand. This is, I think, is the importance of Samuel Adams's portrait of 1773 that John Singleton Copley made. There's a big fight going on in Massachusetts between and I see that my good friend John Tyler is here, so I don't want to talk about Thomas Hutchinson trying to change things, but Adams is pointing to the Massachusetts Charter. And here you have spelled out the rules. And this is one of the fundamental things about Americans is we do have written constitutions and feel they apply to all of us. And you know the rules. And in the 1760s and 70s, the British Parliament was changing the Constitution. England doesn't have a written constitution. It is whatever Parliament determines it is, and also precedent, and so on. And these guys, much as Madison railed against parchment barriers, and yeah, parchment barriers aren't effective, knew that you have written rules, you can understand them. So that's really what strict construction is about. Of course, most people, the most adamant advocates of strict construction will find reasons around it. As Madison understood. That's a good question for another day. State voted not to accept the Constitution. Were there any? Yeah, I think I addressed that. How close did the convention come to including provision that slavery end in 20 years? Not very. They did end the slave trade. Having said that, in the summer of 1787, the Congress was still meeting, and Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River. And that was most of the remaining territory of the United States. So it's a very good question. Could a constitution that ended slavery have been passed by 9 states? No. Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, possibly Delaware would have rejected it. And Madison made the point that even some states which were in New England, Connecticut, and in New York still had slavery, New Jersey had slavery. He saw a protection for the institution there, But Madison and others thought that ultimately slavery would die out because they saw in Virginia, the tobacco industry was pretty much dead. But of course, when the Virginians proposed, let's end the slave trade, the South Carolinians say the only reason you want to end the international slave trade is not because you're horrified at slavery, but because you have too many slaves. You want to sell them to us rather than letting us buy slaves from the West Indies or Africa. It's a very good question, one of the real perplexing questions here. And then it comes up in the South Carolina Convention when, as I said, one of the real arguments for against the Constitution was no Declaration of Rights. And Charles Cotesworth Pinckney at the South Carolina Convention said, you know, most declarations of rights begin with an assertion that all men are created equal. He said, we would make that assertion with a very ill grace indeed, since most of our people are actually born slaves. And it raises that fundamental question about this. And were the framers sincere, like Madison? And by the way, one of the most outspoken opponents of slavery at the convention was Luther Martin of Maryland, who also opposed the Constitution as it was written. And he was sure there was a conspiracy going on, but when the 3/5 clause came up, James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris said, well, if you're going to count enslaved people for representation, why not let them vote? I think one of the big things to remember here is they're grappling with the institution which they understand to be brutal, horrible. They can't find a way around it. And for generations, we let them off the hook, saying, well, their hearts were in the right place. They wanted to end slavery. I think we also have to look at them critically and say, well, what could they have done? And that's, I suppose, a question for another day. Let me just see if there are any other easy questions that I can answer. John Tyler asks, thank you, John. One of the, I might have mentioned, I think it does mention in the little blurb that I co-edited with Bernard Balin a book on the ratification documents. And actually when I was Balin's research assistant, I don't know if you want the full story, John, or just the story about the judge. My assignment was to do biographical sketches of these people who were involved in these debates. And this, Balin was doing a 2-volume. By the way, Bernard Balin passed away just about 2 weeks ago. Great scholar and historian. And so I was his research assistant, and I was to come up with the biographical sketches of these hundreds of people who participated. And for some, it was, you know, the challenge was for someone like Washington or Madison is whittling it down. But for some, you really have to find out anything about this person. And there was one character in North Carolina, Judge Samuel Spencer. And yeah, I did find out when he had served in the legislature. I think he went to Princeton, and I'm saying that in a pejorative way. There's nothing wrong with going to Princeton, of course, for those of you who did. But then Judge Spencer was opposed to ratification, if I'm not mistaken. Then at the end of, well, one April day, he is sitting on his front porch in North Carolina, dozing off, and he's wearing a red hat. And the hat is, you know, if you're sitting on your porch dozing, your head is going to bob up and down. And a turkey in the yard saw Judge Spencer's, he didn't see Judge Spencer, he saw this red hat bobbing up and down. And the turkey took this for a challenge and attacked him. And Spencer was able to fight off the turkey, but the turkey had inflicted wounds, which then became infected, and Judge Spencer died. So naturally, I wanted to put this into his biographical sketch, and I kept, you know, and so I would type. This is in the era of typewriters. I would type up this with a little biographical sketch of Judge Spencer, and then it would have, you know, the red hat, April day, front porch, and Balin kept crossing it out. I do another draft, and this is a draft of everything, and he would go through it, and then I would put in again. Maybe this time I left off the red hat, or maybe I thought that was a critical detail. And this went on for weeks, as neither one of us said anything to the other about this. I wanted to get the turkey in, and he wanted to keep the turkey out. And so this went on for weeks, and he would just keep crossing it out. And then when the book came out, this was about 2 years or 3 years afterward, and you know, I then had finished my graduate work, was teaching, but naturally the first thing I looked at in the book go to Samuel Spencer. And this, I think, says a lot about Balin as a writer. The last sentence of his biographical sketch was, "Died of wounds sustained in an attack by a turkey." Well, perfect. You know, you didn't need the red hat, the front porch, anything else. That tells all you need to know about Judge Spencer and his untimely end. So thank you. I think that's...
Sir, this is Stephen Kinzer. Could I ask
Yes.
you one question
Sure.
before you finish? So I thank you so much for doing this. I was a colonial history student in college back in the last century, so I'm glad to have you keep me up to date on research, and a great fan of Bernard Balin, of course. So I read this book recently, new book called The City-State of Boston.
Yes, by Mark Peterson.
So, right. So this is a fascinating book. One of the points it makes is that essentially Massachusetts made a big mistake. They
Yeah.
never should have ratified the Constitution because it turned us into what is described as a suburb of Alexandria.
Yeah.
We surrendered our sovereignty to the South, which meant accepting the slave trade. So he makes this whole point that it was a big mistake. And then, of course, the Hartford Convention was sort of a chance to figure that out another way. But now I see from reading his book that the nature of the people who were sent there meant that New England was not going to secede at that point. So what do you make of this argument that from the perspective of Boston, we had the hinterland, we had the trade. New England could have been an independent country. It shouldn't have ratified the Constitution. Is that realistic? Could we have survived the War of 1812? Can you imagine it having gone another way, as he suggests in this book?
Yeah. It's a great book. I do recommend it. I do think he's wrong in that, and I think that I was reading. He has this wonderful passage of Josiah Quincy's arguments about how we have ceded too much power, and now. And talking about how this majority beyond us is controlling us, and this is a bad thing. It's exactly the same argument John C. Calhoun is going to make in 1831. I think every state, and it's good to look at these different places as very much independent places. And Massachusetts or New England's real fight for the first 150 years was with New York and New Netherlands and with New France. And so they are very much independent places, and everyone cedes power by joining into this union or cedes something. And for Boston, yeah, I can see that. To answer your question, no, I don't think so, because for the reasons John Jay lays out in his Federalist essays about how the sections of the country won't be able to sustain themselves. After the War of 1812, actually during the War of 1812, I should say, there's a real chance New England would secede, because think about it, the British had burned Washington and they have this army going to the Mississippi River. Jefferson thinks that the whole thing is over at this point, and it very well might have been had it not been for, well, what happens in New Orleans, and more importantly, what happens in Europe with the negotiators, and the British want to end the war. So it's fortuitous, but I think that the trade of New England was, it had been stymied during the Confederation. Is it possible that New England could have maintained its independence if we think about the United States not being the United States, we're thinking about the United States as being these separate places, which is one of the things Madison keeps talking about. Hearken not to that unnatural voice that tells you the people of this union cannot live together as members of the same family. And that's a phrase, actually, it's kind of a thought that Lincoln is going to bring back. As I was reading Mark Peterson's book, I'm thinking about, Theodore Parker, I think it was, who said, we're just a suburb of Alexandria. It's a call to arms. And then you think about what happens afterward. How would an historian writing about the city-state of New Orleans or of Charleston account for their fall after 1865? And, Massachusetts is definitely part of that. And so it's a great book. And Mark is a terrific writer. I'm skeptical about that argument. By the way, Steve, I'm also a big fan of your writing too. So thanks for joining us.
Well, we can have a mutual admiration Zoom society one day.
Other questions or Have we had enough? And do we want to vote yes or no for ratification, against ratification? One of my, actually, I will end with this great story told during the convention. Elizabeth Willing Powell was a woman in Philadelphia, and she was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. And at some point during the convention, she asked him, and as I said, the convention was meeting in secret. Well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? Is it a monarchy or is it a republic? And Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. And that is our challenge. So thank you.
Bob,
Yes, John.
before we all go, on behalf of the Friends of the Truro Meeting House, I just want to say how deeply grateful we are for your doing this today. It was very stimulating, very thought-provoking, as all of your talks in the Meeting House have been. And I am pleased to see that we probably have about 60 viewers when you count several people plugged in are two, not just one. So again, thank you very much. And we hope next year we'll see you in person, all of you at the Meeting House, and thank all of you for joining. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Good to see you
I
all.
hope you do it. I hope you do another one soon.
Thanks, Mary. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Pat. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
That's terrific.
Very well done.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mr. Allison.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Joe.
Nope.
Good to see you. I like
Good
the
to see you.
beard.
Oh, yeah. I'm getting ready for Santa Claus or subordinate clause. But is it true that the turkey was almost a bird of the United States?
That's what I've heard. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Franklin liked the turkey as opposed to the eagle. You know,
Right.
Yeah. Turkey is native, and I'm told that turkeys are very stupid. But I had a student once who was a farmer. He said people think cattle are dumb until they work with turkeys.
Thanks a lot, Bob. It was
Take
great
care.
to see
Good to see you, Joe.
you. All right. Thank you.